Hello, beautiful people, and welcome to the Navia Pulse release analysis. Now, as usual, for these videos, I go through the pre-release, look at the things I got right, look at the things I got wrong, and go into more details about things that I missed. Before we actually start, I want to say that this is not my account. Obviously, what that means is that the testing that I've done has been on a lot of different accounts, and that can make it a bit harder to compare teams one-to-one when some accounts are obviously more invested than others. But I've done my best to try to equalize things. It's also obviously given me the opportunity to test her at a lot of different levels of investment. So let's get right into it. The base defense and base HP, that has started to matter a lot more because they have started more and more to design enemies that are designed around killing you. Just making sure that One thing that honestly, that is related to this that I don't think I ended up mentioning in the pre-release, Serpent Spine does that too. Serpent Spine's increased damage taken also makes it a lot easier to get one shot. And in my testing, it happened quite a few times that I just swapped into her ready to do her E and she just died in one hit, which obviously is not optimal. You tend to do more damage when you're not dead. That doesn't mean it's unplayable or anything like that, but it is a caveat to keep in mind when looking at her. Anyways, so she's not the highest, but at least pretty close to some of the highest, both in terms of base HP and base defense, which is gonna give her, paired with the fact that she triggers Crystallize, and as we'll see when we talk about her teams, synergizes fairly well with units like Zhongli. It's gonna give her an inherent survivability that is going to be pretty okay, this was worded poorly. I don't know if I actually thought that she synergized well with Zhongli, or if that was just a short way of saying that I expected her to be played with Zhongli a lot. But that is something that we'll touch on, or that we'll talk about once we get into the team building sections. I mean, I guess we can quickly address it now. I don't actually think that Zhongli has very good synergy with her. Geo Resonance gives you 20% resistance shred, and the amount of damage that you gain from resistance shred varies a lot depending on how much resistance enemies have. Mainly because if the formula still worked the same way above 75% resistance, which it doesn't, but for the purposes of this example, we can pretend that it does, right? If you had 100% resistance, you would take 0 damage. 90% resistance, you'd take 10% damage. Ooh, you've just multiplied your damage by infinity. In practice, if you have an enemy that has 75% resistance, will take half the damage of an enemy that has 50%. What that means is that 25% shred is doubling your damage. Whereas if you go from 25 to 0, well, you're going from doing 75% of your damage to 100% of your damage, which is a third more, 33% rather than 100%. And it makes it comparatively a lot less effective. The only two elements that have access to shred with no caveats, really, I say elements, but is physical, which has access to shred with superconduct very easily, and Geo, which has access to Geo Resonance's shred, because VV has a relatively short uptime and needs to be triggered on field, which leads to a lot of like, can I actually do a good VV setup that doesn't eat into my carry's uptime too much? Whereas with superconduct or with Geo Resonance, it just happens. This leads to a situation where, because most enemies' base resistance is at 10% for everything, and then it goes up if they're particularly resistant or down if they're not, then against most enemies, the 20% resistance shred that you get from Geo Resonance brings enemies to minus 10% resistance, which multiplies your incoming damage by 105%. In other words, it's about a 17% DPS increase to have that first 20% shred. That second 20% shred that you can get from Zhongli's shield, however, is only 9.5, which makes it comparatively less effective. That doesn't make it not effective, but it is something that goes against him to some extent. What that means, though, is that when you're trying to maximize your Navia's personal damage, assuming you're trying to go for a Geo Resonance, the amount of damage you actually gain from Zhongli is fairly small. So you have to look at the rest of the things that he does. And obviously, his biggest thing is that he gives a big shield, and that's good. It's a useful part of his kit. How good is it? Well, that depends. That depends a lot per player. A lot of players can more easily get away without using shield than others. But Navia is not actually a unit that, unlike Yuemia, for example, has specific combos she really, really wants to stick to that can lead to huge DPS losses if you stray away from them. With Yoimiya, if you have to dash right before you do your N5, you f over your vapes for your next normal attack string, and it's just there. Whereas with Navia, it's a lot easier to get away with it because her actual normal attacks aren't really that strong anyways, and it's really mostly about the skill and the burst. On top of that, you already get, from the fact that she's Geo, you already get crystallizes, which do offer you a fairly good amount of resistance to interruption. Whenever you're shielded, attacks will not stagger you. If you get attacked twice, then the second one can stagger you, but if you get another crystallize by the time you get hit a second time, you won't get staggered either. All of this to say, she doesn't have particularly great synergy with a unit like Zhongli, whose main goal is to add that survivability. On top of that, Zhongli's pillar tends to be fairly unreliable for particle generation, and obviously one of the biggest upsides when you're playing multiple characters of the same element in a team is that you're generating particles of the same element, which restore more energy to those characters. When your energy generation is unreliable, then okay, what do? Do you build more ER? Well, you've lost damage. Do you hope that it works? Well, what happens when it doesn't? You just reset, I guess. It's not the most pleasant scenario. You're gonna have to choose between one of the two. And if you're willing to do that, there's nothing wrong with that. Like, at the end of the day, Zhongli is still one of her good teammates, but we'll get into the why. And it really just boils down to the fact that she doesn't have, which is something that I did mention in the pre-release, she doesn't have very synergistic teammates that are also good right now. But like when it comes to at least a second Geo unit, there's no real Geo unit that is both great and very synergistic with her. So you kind of end up having to choose between one of the two. Anyways, all this to say, I don't actually think that Zhongli is all that synergistic, unlike what I said in the pre-release. Another thing I want to talk about is her upcoming artifact set, because there is an artifact set coming out for her. So it's 18% attack and 50% damage bonus that is conditional upon using skill. Obviously, this doesn't apply to a part of her burst because she, in my opinion, in most situations, will tend to use her burst at the very start of her rotations before she uses her skill. So a part of her burst damage won't benefit from this. To be fair, on your first burst, you can do EQ because by the time you swap into her again, your E cooldown will have elapsed, so you'll have both of your E's back up. But that's assuming you start with both charges of your E, which isn't going to be the case on the second rotation. So that's just like, technically you could run Golden Troop, and as much as her skill is her bread and butter, over a whole rotation, her burst is like about 55. I said burst here, I meant skill. It's fairly easy to tell from the context because I'm talking about Golden Troop, and I'm saying that a specific ability, it can be alright because a specific ability is doing most of her damage. My bad. I meant the skill, not the burst. And of her damage. But yeah, so I think overall it's really mostly her signature. Marie-José if you're playing her in Furina teams, or 2-piece while you're trying to get her signature set. Okay, a few additional details, I guess, on this. Number one, there's a few teams where 4-piece Petra is alright. I'm still not a huge fan of it. It tends to be in teams that I don't think are that great for her. But when you're playing something where, you know, she's kind of just there chilling to be a part of a team that's like already like, I don't know, double Electro or something like that, then Petra can be a viable option. Other than that, Marie-José is generally better in teams that have Furina than her signature, but can be a bit annoying to like have to wait a little bit for your first E. Otherwise you don't actually get the stacks before you E, and obviously that means your E doesn't benefit from that crit rate, which is fine if it crits, and not great if it doesn't. So that's another thing that you should keep in mind. If you're a dedicated Navia main, I don't think it's worth having both a Marie-José and a set of her signature set. But if you're not a dedicated Navia main, if you're just, you know, you like her, you play her, and you also sometimes play other things, and you don't tend to play her outside of teams that also use Furina, I definitely don't think it's worth farming her artifact set. But at the end of the day, that decision will be up to you. And finally, for Golden Troop, it tends to be a little bit better in specific teams where you don't spend field time on her, which generally tends to be kind of quick swappy, mainly Noelle teams. If you are playing one of those teams, then Golden Troop is a lot better in those teams. I still wouldn't use it over her signature if you have her signature, but obviously if you don't, then you can't use it, and it is a new set, so Golden Troop is very viable there. before we start getting into the usual like weapon counts and stuff like that, I do want to very briefly mention, I think that on release, there's going to be like 2 teams where she's pretty good. I think she's going to be pretty good with a Bennett Xiangling core. I think that's the first one. And I think the second one, a Furina team. Okay, I want to apologize for this. This should not be showing Bennett Xiangling Furina. This should be showing Bennett Furina Flex. The Flex can be Xiangling, but it can also be a Geo unit. I do think that those are her 2 best teams. I think that she's a lot better with Bennett and then with either Xiangling or Furina, plus an additional slot, than she is in other teams. But I try when I do my pre-releases to, yes, look at the optimal stuff and overall come to conclusions about how good things are. But I don't want to be like an elitist, you have to play the best thing kind of guy. And while it wasn't my intent here, I definitely think it can very easily come across that way. And I want to apologize for that. Navia, fortunately, is a unit that is strong enough that her non-optimal teams, her teams that are not necessarily the best Navia teams, are still good teams. And I should not have like outright stated that she has like, oh, she has 2 good teams. She has 2 best teams maybe, but a lot of the other teams that are maybe not quite as good in terms of how well the units synergize together and how well the team overall performs are still good teams. And again, we'll get into that more once we get to the actual team building section of the video. What I'm getting at here is if Navia came out while Navia was already out, if there was already a Navia in the game and Navia came out, both of those Navias would become significantly stronger. Navia's best teammate would be herself. One thing I want to add to this, Navia's skill hold animation, when you try to hold it for as short of a period as possible, is longer than I expected it to be. What that means is that if you are actually doing a EN4E or EN3 and do E, your second E at least is coming out about a second later than I expected, which means that if another Navia were to come out today, while she probably would be with Navia in Navia's best team, it would also potentially not work as well with some of the supports that are currently very good with Navia, like Bennett. Because you'd end up with both of them competing for Bennett uptime, and Bennett uptime maybe not necessarily actually being enough because of those couple more seconds you're spending in animations. That doesn't necessarily mean that they can't or won't do it. What it does mean is that it would potentially incentivize some different healers in teams like this. Either ones that are already released, like Kokomi, for example, or Barbara, and we'll talk about Barbara in a bit, or maybe future Geo healers. Let's talk about what she works with right now. Because there is currently in the game a character that is Navia-like. It's just that it's not a very good character. I've been doing a bit of Ning testing today, and man, this character is not good. And the reality is that, unfortunately, Ning's performance is lacking, which means that the team overall will be just fine. Yeah, I think the Ning versions of the team ended up a little bit better than I expected them to be. Maybe that's not actually it. I think it's more so that the Zhongli and Albedo versions of the teams ended up feeling a lot more clunky than I expected them to. Which made it so that the competition was less steep. Ning is still a fairly reasonable unit to use with Navia. I think that a C0 Ning is not very good with Navia, but a High Constellation Ning can very well be used, and it's not like the most insane thing, but it is very playable, like it works out. However, there is a character that I completely overlooked, and that character is GeoMC. GeoMC is unironically good for Navia. I'm not gonna say GeoMC is good, period, because that's not f***ing true. GeoMC very much has the exact same issues as Ning. Something that can be a bit of a pain in the ass with Ning is how her C1 interacts with her particle ICD, which makes it very difficult to actually get 2 instances of particle generation unless you start swapping into her at really weird moments in your rotation. GeoMC doesn't have that issue, and the overall damage that you're outputting with GeoMC is not as good as the damage you're outputting with Ning, but the animations are a lot shorter, and you're getting a few non-insignificant buffs. You're getting 10% crit rate and resistance to interruption from GeoMC's constellations. I will say, I don't like GeoMC with Navia when you're not against bosses, because GeoMC's skill, when it actually spawns, is the worst thing to work around in the game, and I hate it. But when you're against bosses, you can just throw your meteor on their hitbox, and it's just not actually gonna spawn. It's just gonna do the damage and dip. And while technically that is not optimal for damage, because the technically optimal way to use GeoMC is to have the meteor close to the enemy so that the AoE hits them, but not on their hitbox, so that it doesn't despawn, so that eventually it gets destroyed, either when you summon 3 meteors, or just over time, or just because the boss damaged it, and then it can deal its damage again due to GeoMC's, I believe, Constellation 2. I don't find that to be worth the trouble, because the actual damage you gain isn't like that insane, and the brain worms you're gonna get are that insane, so I don't think that's worth it at all. But after doing some testing on it, I have actually quite liked GeoMC with Navia. To me, it felt a lot like playing Albedo or Zhongli, perhaps a little bit worse overall, but with the very significant upside that because your energy generation with GeoMC is front-loaded, you just press it and then you get the energy. Not only is it a lot more reliable than Zhongli's Pillar or Albedo's Flower, which can get destroyed and stop generating energy, it also helps a lot if you end up killing an enemy before your rotation is over and you finish the chamber without full energy on Navia. It takes a while to get that energy to get your burst on the next chamber, and that's kind of a pain in the ass, and it feels a lot better with GeoMC. I think it's gonna feel a lot worse in abysses that are not just bosses in every single chamber of the side, right? Obviously, the performance of GeoMC and Navia teams is slightly skewed by the fact that this current abyss has a boss in second half on chambers 1, 2, and 3, so you don't have to deal with the meteor ever. It just never spawns due to boss hitboxes. But at least in those, I've actually found that GeoMC is a very reasonable replacement for the other Geo units, and if I had ended up getting Navia on my account, I think I'd actually rather play them over Albedo or Zhongli. Let's talk about her ER requirements. I'm going to use this team as the default. If we look at some of the worst and best case scenarios, brings her ER requirements as low as around 115, and if you look at more worst case scenario, that is not actually the best case scenario. In the best case scenario, you kill enemies in one rotation, and you can cheat out an additional E, which is something that I think I end up mentioning. Yeah, you can see my shirt color changes from this to this because it was recorded on a different day, because I realized that I should have mentioned it. I end up talking about the ability to do 3 E's on the first rotation, and obviously if the enemies are dying in a 1 rotation, then it can reduce her ER requirements because you get 1 more E on that first rotation, or you can in some teams. We'll talk about some of the teams where that's not quite as doable as well. Realistically, I think 150 to 160 is going to be relatively safe. So, okay, I think a lot of people have found that in practice they can get away with a lot less because they tend to not need that many rotations to kill enemies. Navia's play pattern is very straightforward, which means that it's very easy to focus on properly doing your stuff, which makes it so that if you have the DPS to be able to rotate an enemy, it's not all that difficult to do so. And if you are rotating an enemy, then obviously, right, you're getting 3 particles or 3 skills on the first one, 2 skills on the second one, but then also, I don't know, maybe you wait a little bit for that second rotation because the enemy's moving and being cringe, so maybe you do 1 more Bennett E. Or, you don't actually finish the chamber with that additional energy, but you're just willing to battery Fav proc into her at the start of the next chamber. And because of that, her ER requirements can get lowered more if you're willing to do those things. And that's something that I should have mentioned more. ER requirements can go up quite a bit if you're playing her in teams that generate less energy, with characters that are more energy black holes than generators, and it can be lower if you're playing characters that generate more energy. I did mention that it can be lower, but I should have explained the ways that you could lower them without having to rely only on team building. A weapon like Sacrificial Greatsword is actually going to be pretty good for her. Now, there are some caveats to that. If you use her skill 17 seconds later, while there's still a little bit of cooldown left to the second charge, then instead of effectively giving you one more charge, it's just going to set this 0.5 cooldown remaining for the charge that you're about to get to 0, and you're effectively not going to gain anything. So that's caveat number 1. Number 2, you can't get a 100% chance to proc on Sac. She has something in her kit that alleviates that, though. The Uzia hit that you get when you use your skill can actually proc Sac. There is one caveat that is a corollary of something that I mentioned earlier, which is that her skill animation, when you're doing a short hold, is a bit longer than I expected it to be, which does mean that your cooldown is starting a little bit later, which can also be one of the things that works against Sac Greatsword. Refine. At low refine, I don't think it's very good, because you have to wait for the cooldown of the Sac Greatsword, which is at R1 30 seconds, and that doesn't line up with rotations very well. I think R3 is the bare minimum for it to be an actual good option on her. I will say, even at R3, I think it's a bit rough. Yeah, I probably should have said R4 plus rather than R3. It still works at R3, but because most people don't actually do incredibly tight 20-second rotations when their rotation is 20 seconds. So a 22-second cooldown isn't the end of the world. But sometimes they do. Sometimes even without focusing on it too much. Maybe you swapped out of her a little bit early because you were about to die because an enemy was hitting you. Then you start your next rotation and it hasn't been 22 seconds and you're just like, oh, well, that's not great. It's more so R4 plus rather than R3 plus. I think makes one of the teams that I had previously mostly discounted a lot stronger. And that's with Bennett, Xiangling, Furina. One thing I will say, in my experience, this has been the team that I've liked the most. And just like Sac helps a lot to help make it good, the other ways that you can cheat out energy even without Sac through doing a 3E rotation on your first rotation because of the way that the cooldowns line up mean that you don't even need the Sac Sword to make it work. On your first rotation, because if you use your E and then you auto for a little bit and then your E for your second charge and you auto for a little bit, the animation for both of those E's and all of those autos is about 9 seconds, and that's the cooldown for your E. So you can get a third E on that first rotation if you start with 2 charges. Another thing that I should mention is you can actually technically get a 4E first rotation. When I talk about 3E rotation stuff, what I mean is, you know, you do your setup, you swap to her, you E, 4 autos, E, 4 autos, maybe another one, and then another E, right? That's what I mean when I talk about a 3E rotation. But, I don't know if you noticed, but I swap into Navia to use her burst at the beginning. Right? I do this, which means you can actually do EQ here. And then do Zhongli hold E, which I did, whatever. And then you can do E. And technically this specific order, you'll run out of Bennett uptime, but you can start with her burst rather than Furina, right? So you can do this, Furina EQ, Zhongli hold E, Bennett EQ. I swap into her and my cooldown's back. So I can do the same thing. I can do the same thing. And I can even use my burst already here, use it early. I got my 4E first rotation, but I funneled one of the E's from the first rotation into the second one, which lets me end up with effectively 3's worth of energy per rotation for the first 2 rotations, which is another way where you can cheat out additional energy. It doesn't help you with front-loading damage nearly as much because the first E that I did was completely unbuffed, literally with no Furina, no Bennett, no nothing, no crystallize, right? So it doesn't change the damage very much, but it can help you a lot for your ER requirements. If you're running like low ER and you think that you can reliably 2-rotate the chambers. This is not low ER. So as I mentioned at the start of this video, I did not actually end up going for Navia. So at the end of the day, there's only so much insight that I can have from the calcs and the limited testing I've done. And so if you're looking to get the perspective of someone else who I consider to be trustworthy, you can check out Jamie's videos. Yeah, outside of the like just run video, he's made 2 videos on her. I don't think we end up agreeing on every single thing, but if you're looking to get different perspective, check out his channel and his videos. Verdict, which is her signature option, that's technically best in slot, but often not worth. Also stand by that. It is her best weapon, but in the realm of how much damage you gain from signature weapon upgrades, it's not great. Because of how good Sac Greatsword can be, I think these 4 options, if you have an R5 Sac Greatsword, aren't really worth considering. I think when you're willing to do the, like, cheating out the additional energy or low rotation clears, that isn't true. And these weapons are still worth considering over, maybe not Scoured Pride, because that one is also just, you know, giving you ER. If you don't need it, then it's not. Yeah, in those situations, it can be worth, these weapons can be worth considering, but even then, I feel like unless you're speedrunning, like the actual damage you gain from using a weapon like Wolves or Unforged or Song of Broken Pines, and yeah, Song of Broken Pines is almost as good as the other 2 just because it has high base attack. So, but anyways, the damage that you gain, when you compare that to the fact that you can get 1 more E with Sac, even without looking at the ER requirements, is minor. And so the added quality of life that you get from getting that additional energy so that you don't have to leave the enemy alive to get a couple more E's at the end of your rotation, I still would consider to be worth it. I would run a high refined Sac Sword over a Wolf's or Unforged. I would generally run Mega Magic Sword, the new event weapon, over a low refined Sac Sword. Like, I really think that at low refined, Sac Greatsword is just not the same weapon, unfortunately. But yeah, so overall, right? Her, like, weapon order, I'd put Verdict first, then Serpent Spine, then Bacon and Redhorn, then High Refined Sac, with the caveat that in some teams it might actually just be the best weapon. Then, yeah, probably these 4 all together. Then Event Weapon, then Sac Greatsword, then Tidal Shadow, probably. Yeah, I think that ranking is more or less. Maybe low refined Sac Greatsword would actually be even lower than Tidal Shadow. This one I'm not entirely sure. I didn't end up doing a lot of testing on low refined Sac Greatsword because it's unpleasant. Okay, last thing I want to mention. I think that there's a lot of confusion going around as to why some people don't even mention Sac Greatsword as an option. I want to just take a second to, I guess, speculate on that. I think that a lot of people don't really realize that everyone's account is different and that, you know, not everyone has the battle pass. Not everyone is willing to spend on a weapon banner. Not everyone, like primo gems or money. Not everyone has the primo gems saved up to be able to go on a weapon banner without spending money. And they just look at it, well, Serpent Spine is better than Sac Greatsword, therefore why bother mentioning Sac Greatsword? And it's not like malicious, it's just, I don't know what it is. I don't think it's malicious. But anyways, my point with this is basically just R5 Sac Greatsword is a good weapon option on Navia. I think that it generally doesn't tend to be better than Verdict or Serpent Spine, or even Bacon and Redhorn, but it is definitely, in my opinion, good enough that if you have a high refined Sac Greatsword, it's a pretty huge deterrent from wishing on her weapon banner, because it's actually a fairly strong option. And then finally, we look at teams. The more I think about it, the more I like the Navia National. I don't like Naviational. Like that's kind of boring, you know? I've given up on trying to find a better name than Naviational and just settled on it. I mean, we can mention it though. Yeah. Double Hydro with Bennett, it's gonna be good. Hot Rock, gonna be good. You can do like quote-unquote hyper, but it's not really hyper because you're still getting damage from Furina, but with Bennett, Zhongli, Furina, it's gonna be alright. I think it's a bit better than I gave it credit for here. It'll still be fine though. Maybe it does get to good. I don't know. Okay, never mind. I changed it to good. Well done, pre-release, Jeff. Now you can look at teams with Furina without Bennett, right? So you're looking at Furina, Jean, Zhongli. No, Furina. I don't like this team. It works. but I'm not a fan of Jean in the slot over some of the other healers. Even if you're not using Bennett, I would much rather see a unit like Kokomi or even maybe Barbara in a team like this. So let's talk about Barbara for a second here. Barbara is pretty good with Furina. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. So if Barbara can generate enough energy over a rotation to burst every rotation, then she is a character who can wield TTDS, provide Hydro Resonance, and front load a massive amount of healing at the touch of a button in your rotation, which is going to get you a lot of fanfare very early into a rotation. But Barbara does not generate any energy, and her burst cost is 80. Technically, her Constellation 1 gives her 2 energy per rotation, so her burst cost is 78. And reaching the amount of ER that you need to burst every rotation without an ER weapon on Barbara requires incredibly high investment because you'll need a lot of ER in your substats. ER in your substats that I don't think I have on my account, even going on random artifacts. And if you can't run TTDS, then she's just really not that great. All of that being said, if you really love Barbara, you think that she's a poggers character, this is actually, with Barbara in this slot, a pretty good Barbara team. And also, believe it or not, a pretty decent Navia team. Rina, Jean, Yelan. I think they're going to be alright. They're not going to be like cope, but they're also not going to be great. I mean, again, right, it's I always try to leave this somewhat vague because it is very difficult to like properly convey what makes a team good and how good a team is. But like, from the way I've explained it, I think that I slightly undersold the Furina teams without Bennett with Navia, and that they are a little bit better than I gave them credit for. Yeah, I guess also with like Noelle or Itto, I think Itto's field time requirements are a bit too high for him to synergize well, but it'll be okay. I like it a little bit more with Noelle. You can do something. Yeah, like, okay. I think that you don't really get very good synergy between Navia and Itto, but the lack of great Geo units make it so that the last slot in an, or like it's the last 2 slots in an Itto team after you already have your Itto and your Goro, right? The last 2 slots really aren't that competitive, which means that Navia will be a viable option getting for one of those last 2 slots over a unit maybe like Zhongli or Albedo. The limited amount of Geo units that we have and the fact that some of them are just pretty bad is going to proportionally hurt Itto a lot more than Navia because, well, he wants 3 of them, not 2. And he kind of really wants 3 of them. But again, right, like it's like all of this to say that I think that Navia is a fine option in Itto teams, but very, very replaceable there. For the Noelle teams, I think I'm still not entirely sure what I think about them. I see the value of it. I also think they feel really ass to play. I think that if you are a Noelle main and you know, really want to play Noelle, then having Navia as an available option against more single target focused chambers can be pretty valuable. But if you're not a Noelle main and you just, you know, are wondering, okay, I have this Noelle, I can use her sometimes. Where should I use her? Where can I use her? Where is she good? I feel like if you want a single target team, you're not gonna actively go for a Noelle team unless you're an actual Noelle main. And if you are a Noelle main, then yeah, Navia is a nice option for some of Noelle's teams. But if you're not, then the main potential situations where you'll use Noelle is when Noelle is really good, or at least like when Noelle is really in her element, which is big ass AoE situations. And in those situations, I do not like Navia and Noelle teams very much. I haven't mentioned Ning because I just don't think that double carry team with Ning is going to be particularly good. I definitely undersold that. Just in general, Hot Rock or quote-unquote Hyper can use Ning, or, as I mentioned earlier in the post release, GeoMC. That's where I leave it for teams in the pre-release, but I do want to mention a few other teams that I've tested. I mean, I've tested Hyperbloom. I don't like it. It clears. It's not like a bad team, but it's like, I mean, I talked about it when I was playing it. Usually when you try to force a unit that has no synergy with Hyperbloom in a Hyperbloom team, it's because it's not a good unit and you just want them to feel playable. And Navia is not a bad unit, so she doesn't need that. And so I see a lot less value value in shoving her in a Hyper Bloom core. I've also looked at double Electro, double Geo, and like weird taser mixes with Furina, without Furina. I think they're all right. I don't think they either perform or feel as good as the other teams I've tested. I think that in general, for teams that aren't using either Furina or Bennett or both, tend to not do quite as well, but she's strong enough that they're still fine teams. Well, let us actually talk about her synergy with it. So I guess that leaves you with Noelle, Zhongli, Albedo, Ning, and I guess Geo MC. You can use Geo MC. I think the synergy's fine, but Geo MC is just not a great character, a bit like Ning. Yeah, I do think that, like, especially after having tested it, Geo MC feels a lot better than I expected him to, or I guess, than I expected them to. Overall in my testing, I've mostly found that the solo Geo team with Bennett, Stanley, and Furina was the one that tended to feel the best, the most consistently. But out of the Geo options, again, right, like I said earlier, I think that if there was one that I had to stick with, it might actually end up being the Geo MC one. By the way, if you do play Geo MC, do short hold on Geo MC. Never ever do tap E on Geo MC. It's so bad. The auto targeting is omega scuffed, and the animation is longer than if you do a short hold. So I do this and try to swap, versus if I try to short hold and then swap, it's faster. And the auto targeting isn't cringe because you can actually point where you want it to go. But again, right, like I mentioned earlier with Geo MC, when you're not against bosses, it feels a lot worse. The more I think about it, the more I look at the numbers, I am kind of drawn towards the solo Geo Sac Greatsword teams. If you have a high refined Sac, I think they're actually going to be pretty decent. But yeah, and again, I don't think that those are Sac Greatsword only. I really think that those are the teams that I gravitate towards the most, with or without Sac Greatsword. But obviously, right, there's the fact that Bennett, Stanley, Furina are good units, and so you might have another character who you want to play that uses them, which is why it's still very relevant to talk about how good the Geo units are. That does it for the post-release. I think that the biggest miss of the pre-release was Geo MC. Like, I'm not happy I missed Geo MC, but I am really happy to see a team where Geo MC's Geo MC actually feels good. And again, like there is this guy that I really want to make sure I mention every time I talk about it, because this Abyss is one-side boss only, and Geo MC is not going to feel as good outside of stuff like that. But again, just like Sac Greatsword, it's like, it's nice when things that have been thought of as useless or like just fairly not good for a long time find new usage through new units. It's just really cool. It's kind of like as if you're getting 2 new units at once, because who the f was playing Geo MC before this? You know? But yeah, so I'm not glad that I didn't think of it sooner, but I am very glad to be proven wrong about how well Geo MC works with Navia. I'm very, very, very glad I gave it an honest shot, because I still hadn't tested it before today. But as usual, when I do my post releases, I try to, you know, as much as I can, be very sure about everything I'm saying. And so I really tried to test all of the teams that I could see potential in. Yeah, I'm really glad I did. And again, right, I saw that there were a lot of people whose takeaway from this video was, wow, Sac Greatsword is second coming of Jesus Christ. So I really want to make it clear. I don't think Geo MC is great by any means with Navia. I think Geo MC is alright with Navia, which is infinitely better than Geo MC outside of Navia, and which is why I am so excited and positive about it. A unit going from miserable to use to serviceable is a massive upgrade. In any case, that's going to do it for the post-release. I hope you guys learned a thing or two. I hope you enjoyed. I will see you guys in the next video, which should probably be the Cloud Retainer pre-release. And boy, are we in for a banger. So subscribe, you don't want to miss it. Bye-bye.